Hey guys, this is Professor Heimlich here. I'm sorry I am recording off of my smartphone. Um, I know this is not the best video quality, that it's kind of messed up. You're getting a big old close up of my face. I'm sorry about that. I know it's at an awkward angle. It is sitting on a book in my lap. I tried 4 times to get everything to work on Canvas Studio through the netbook that is sitting on my lap. Um, anyway, so. We're looking at Chapter 8, Antebellum Free Blacks, this week. I'll be uploading this to YouTube, hopefully, here in a little while. Um, and this is originally actually a discussion class. We usually, for this class, had kind of surprise, make a big U, and talk about it together, go over all the different options and everything, and go over like different topics. So some of that ended up as part of our discussion for this week. Do not forget to do your discussion questions. If you do, that will deny you your participation grade. Keep up to date with what is on Canvas in terms of announcements. It's very important. Hopefully this fifth recording session will work. Excuse me. And let's get started. And you should go online, pull up the slideshows, which I have included on Canvas already under the Announcements tab, so that you can kind of read along as we go. All right, so our first major topic is going to be the treatment of free blacks in the North versus free blacks in the South. And we'll also be looking at, just after that, free blacks in the West. As you can see here on the third slide, you've got extreme racism by working class whites versus blacks. Basically, they're afraid that African Americans are going to take our jobs, and work for lower wages and worse conditions, so on and so forth. They don't want to be part of the same social circles as them, and so on. There's also exclusion of blacks from political life by whites in most states and localities, meaning they don't have the right to vote, they can't run for office, they can't submit legislation and work in political office, so on and so forth. This is pretty universal, and this is not going to change really until Reconstruction. There's also riots and physical violence, beatings, and murders and things of that, though not as many murders, there's just general violence. This usually happens when there is rumor of a rape or a murder, or more, and oftentimes if a black person is accused of those crimes and then they get off, which leads to mob violence and vigilantism. And racism in the workplace. If you're black, you're working in the 19th century in, we'll say, a shipyard or a factory or any particular business, the chances that you're going to get the cushy position, the managerial position, the nice raise, the better pay, extremely unlikely. All right. In the South, you don't actually see as much violence perpetuated in a vigilante method against blacks. There isn't really much of a workplace for blacks to work in. This is because rather than vigilante murders and the like, you generally just see re-enslavement as the punishment of choice. They're free blacks have been freed by their masters, manumitted, so on and so forth, are not allowed to migrate into the South. The Southerners are afraid that the only reason why a black person would willingly live in the South after getting freedom is that they would be there to help free the slaves and create slave rebellions and help other slaves escape and so on and so forth. And so they ban slaves from coming from outside of the states that, outside of that state and settling there. So if you get freed, you decide you want to go to the north, to New York or, Massachusetts, and it turns out that you can't really make it there, you're not going to be able to come home again. Well, what if you don't leave? Well, if you stay, there are a bunch of extra rules that apply to you, and as always, the punishment for not following these rules is re-enslavement. Oftentimes, you would have to have a white guardian. You're basically treated as a child. You're not allowed to make your own legal decisions. Someone basically has to vouch for you living in the South and show that you're not a troublemaker, that you're not a rebel element. And that means you're probably going to have to give those people something in return, whether that be free labor, putting up with a certain amount of BS. Maybe you're a slave driver. Just a thought. Um, but if you ever piss off your guardian, they can have you re-enslaved. There are curfews. If you're a free black person living in the South, you can't stay out past a certain hour. If you're caught, you can be re-enslaved. Um, if they claim they catch you outside of out on curfew, it's your word against that of the slave driver or the slave patrol. And remember, blacks aren't allowed to testify against whites in the South, which means that it's your guardian versus them. And are they going to show up for you? Are they going to do that? Are they going to back you up in this instance? And lastly, they can't travel without papers or leave the state for long periods of time. Once again, this all comes down to he said, she said. If you get stopped by the slave patrol and they don't like how you didn't bow your head, how if you gave them the wrong look, if they're in a bad mood, they could take your papers, tear them up, and throw them in the ditch. And you will still end up re-enslaved by the slave patrols here. And basically, you live under the authoritarian boot, like it's 1984 if you live in the South. Anything and everything. Jaywalking, using foul language, failing to kiss the wrong person's butt, being accused of rape or sexual assault by a white woman or being put up to it. Even if it's not true, you really basically have no way of actually digging yourself out of that kind of accusation. At which point, you're getting re-enslaved. That is unfortunately just the fact of life of being a free black person living in the South. The whole system is designed to drive freed black people out of the South and to re-enslave them if they stay. All right. In the North, a lot of what happens with free blacks is them kind of getting caught in the crossfire here. We'll discuss a little bit more with the Free Soil Party and the Know Nothings, but there's a very strong surge of immigration into the North around this time. Germans, Italians, eventually some Jews, and the Irish. And there's this belief that those people are foreign invaders and they are taking their jobs. And a large amount of the reliance in a lot of these northern places for southern cotton starts to go away, and the economy becomes more and more driven by this excessive, cheap immigrant labor willing to work jobs for lower wages and worse conditions and worse hours than their native, giant air quotes, American counterparts, their old school American counterparts. And they see black Americans that have been freed, that are coming up from the South, in the same vein. Yet another element that could eventually lead to the lowering of their wages, a decrease in standard of living, a decrease in that, and basically see them as scabs, as a threat to their way of life. And if you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, they actually show you during the Civil War one of the riots, and then one of the things that happens to the riots is really Irish immigrants against white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that were born in the United States, and one of the things that happens is both sides end up lynching and attacking black people, kind of caught in the middle. And one of the things that is ironic is that the Fugitive Slave Act does help kind of shift the hatred of black people in the North a little bit in the opposite direction, because while it is this whole idea that you can, if you hate slavery, you're not necessarily racist, isn't really true for 19th century America. The Fugitive Slave Act forcing northern whites to be part of the slavery apparatus is kind of a step too far. A lot of opinions get changed, though some people do blame the blacks for being targeted by the Fugitive Slave Act, and this means that they are getting punished for not allowing the slave patrols to get them. Though it is thankfully not as common as one would think. But this means that free blacks in the North have to add being afraid of re-enslavement to all of their other myriad of problems and issues that they're going to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. All right, and that leaves us with the West, that third section that you almost never hear about when you talk about the antebellum period, the lead up to the American Civil War, or any of that stuff. And there's a virulent strain of racism on against black people in the West, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Um, During this period, there are a lot of poor, desperate people moving out to the West seeking their fortune. Land is cheap and plentiful. There are the gold and silver rushes. Um, and they see, again, blacks as a threat to their making their way out there. They don't want to give up land or jobs or wages or being underbid by black people. Um, and there's also a lot of Southerners who move to the West themselves, that the Southern economy doesn't work for them, and they partially blame slave labor for that problem. Like, how dare these enslaved peoples work for free? And so you see this very virulent mix of anti-black sentiment. For one thing, they try to ban African Americans, black people, from coming to the West to begin with. Um, the notable exception is California. They try to push those kinds of laws and codes through, and they are rejected. And they're pretty much the only state in the West that does that. There's a lot of the old racist, stereotypical fears of black men seducing or raping white women, stealing jobs, or becoming vagrants in a way, a burden on society, or even bandits. Because this is the Wild West. There are highwaymen and banditry and all that kind of stuff going on. Um, Despite this though, them trying to ban them from going, there's still massive migration to the West by free blacks. For one, the West isn't like the South. They can't throw a giant wall around the entire American West. There aren't mandatory slave patrols where everyone is levied for up to 6 months out of the year, stopping black people from showing up. This just doesn't exist, and the opportunity for land, for wealth, for glory in the West is attractive, regardless of the amount of melanin that one happens to have in one's skin. As I said, the South is this horrible meat grinder designed to entrap freed black people back into slavery, and most people are willing to risk being beaten or killed, or in the West versus re-enslaved in the South. In the West, there's a lot of similarities also as to how they are treated. Like the North, they can't vote, and they can't hold public office. They also can't testify against whites in the West, but also in Pennsylvania by this time. Pennsylvania sees this weird backslide into being a far more racist state during the antebellum post War of 1812 period than we had seen before. And in the West, you have hangings, beatings, riots, and eventually, by the time we get to Reconstruction, full-on massacres where the whites in town murder literally all the black people that live in the town, oldest to youngest, one after the other. And you see these kinds of riots and mass murders all the way into the 1820s. Henry Fonda, one of my favorite actors, the star of my favorite movie, 12 Angry Men, famously got his very liberal, anti-racism, anti-violent views from viewing this Red September crisis, this mass murder of blacks in his town, where he was dragged out to a lynching where they burned the guy who got off on some kind of basic charge that was like totally made up, and he was burned alive, and right in front of him. And they made him go out and pose with his parents had him go out and pose with the body, and he was so disturbed by it that it made him a lifelong activist for equality. To give you an idea of the kind of violence that happens in the West against free blacks, going all the way into the 20th century. Perhaps the most famous incident involving violence in the West over the status of African Americans is the Bleeding Kansas incident, which went 7 long years, 1854 to 1861. Basically, originally Kansas is supposed to be a free state. It is covered by the Missouri Compromise and the compromise over the inclusion of Louisiana Territory into the United States. And eventually the South just kind of wears the North down, and they decide that instead of following the previous instructions, they're going to go with what's called popular sovereignty. Basically, the people of Kansas Territory will get to vote, and based on that vote, they will determine whether or not Kansas is going to be a free state or a slave state. And what begins to happen is everyone immediately starts to cheat, and violence almost immediately happens. Pro-slavery Missourians pour over the border, claim that they live in Kansas, and vote for it to be a slave state. And in response to this, people from as far away as Massachusetts, where John Brown's family emigrated to Kansas, show up to counterbalance in the opposite direction. And what happens is mass murder and violence. John Brown and his sons believe, and this isn't a stereotype, this isn't a trope, like I've talked to about with the slave revolts, where every time a slave revolt happens, the white Southerners claim that the black person was crazy, that they heard voices. John Brown writes and states publicly that he had heard the voice of God, and God told him to butcher slave owners with a sword. And that's his words. And he does. He shows up, he attacks them in their homes, there's open fighting. They create two different capitals run by two different governments, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery. They do battle with one another. It's almost like the Civil War before the Civil War became cool. And eventually the pro-slavery side writes to the president, who's pro-slavery, and they bulldoze the capital of abolitionist Kansas to the ground. And 4 different state constitutions are basically in the space of like a year all sent to Congress. But by that time, the Republicans have gained control of this new anti-slavery, pro-education, pro-American system and party. And they accept what's called the Winnedock Constitution, which makes Kansas a free state in 1861, just in time for the Civil War to begin. All right. And which leads us to our next topic, the power of education and the importance of education for free blacks and generally society at large. Education is one of the great signifiers of civilization. When we watched our video about the Kingdom of Mali, what was one of the big things that they pushed for? To build the University of Timbuktu, a great center of learning, to show how civilized and equal they are to the great European and Middle Eastern powers in the Arab world. And that should give you a hint as to a few of the reasons why education is really important. Before we get into why it's important, though, it's not a bad idea to go over the timeline in terms of black Americans in higher education. A guy named Alexander Lucius Twilight is the first black American to have graduated from a college that we're aware of. There are some that we know attended college before then, and a few that are rumored to have graduated. However, we don't have any actual written evidence or historical proof that this was the case. But Lucius Twilight graduates in 1823 from Middlebury College in Vermont, and he's our first. Basically proven instance of an African American man getting a college degree, got a bachelor's. Edward Jones is the next. He doesn't get his from Amherst College until 1826. So Alexander Lucius Twilight is the first, but he doesn't really open the floodgates. Edward Jones, on the other hand, graduates, and then about 3 or 4 others graduate in the months after him. So at this point, we begin to see a definite shift towards access to higher education, at least somewhat, for free black Americans. And it isn't going to be another 10 years until Isaiah DeGrasse graduates from what is then Newark University, which I believe now is called the University of Delaware. And that's going to be the first case of a black man graduating from a major state-run university. And there's a big difference. Getting a degree from, a small local college is not the same for a job provider or for prestigious reasons or getting into a graduate school as going to a major university. And lastly, in 1833 in Ohio, a state, ironically, that black people are banned from going to, Oberlin College opens, which is our first college that is meant to cater to the needs of black people seeking an education. So at this point, we have our first historically black college, which means that we have a lot more access at that point to education for free black Americans if you're willing to go to Ohio, a state that hates black people and is trying to keep them out, to get there. But that also tells you that if you can open a free black college in a state that doesn't want black people to arrive, just how enforceable those laws really were at the time, so not very. But it does also show you the will of the white citizens of Ohio, that they would try to keep them out anyway. All right, so why is education so important now that we've gone over the timeline of how long it took, roughly a decade, and 23 years after the turn of the century, to get an education? Well, the first one, for many of you that are in my course, you're looking at jobs. And in today's economy, especially, jobs are important. You can't get certain jobs without an education, whether it be a formal education or an apprenticeship or a job in management. You need to know what you're doing. You need to have the right degree to get the job. There's also prestige. I can't tell you the number of times selling freaking refrigerators on my day job that I can lean on, well, I have a master's degree. At which point they suddenly, after being like looking down their nose, being like, "Oh, you appear to be an hourly employee. Why should I believe that you know anything about anything?" And I'm like, "Oh, this is my day job. I teach history. I have a master's." At which point suddenly, oh, this person is to be taken seriously. It's harder to discount someone out of blind ignorance or classism, or, in this case, very importantly, racism, if you have a degree, a college degree. It is a sign that you of a basic level of competence. And a lot of these upper class folks have some form of degree, and if they discount your degree, they're discounting their degree as well. And they're not willing to do that for their ego. One of the things you generally pick up in college is a strong vocabulary and speaking skills. It's easy to discount someone who stutters, who has a hard time finding words, who can't really express themselves effectively, of being inferior. You don't have to give them a chance. They make a bad first impression, they can discount it, and that's it. People are more likely to respect and empathize with someone who speaks clearly and makes sense. You're also less likely, as certain people may have found out recently, to accidentally crash the entire stock market by holding a press conference, in which case it's obvious that you're an ignorant moron and that you are going to ruin everything, so everyone starts selling all their stock shares. Just to lure a little, weave a little bit of current events into the importance of education. Knowledge. Knowledge has a power of its own. Knowing where to find information is a key part of education. If you are being mistreated as a black man in the 19th century, how do you respond? What are the laws? Can you testify in your state? Do you know? So not every state in the West bans whites and blacks from testifying against whites, and not every state in the North does that either. If you came from Ohio, do you know that California doesn't have those kinds of laws in place? Do you know that you can vote? How do you find the right resources to get the job done? These are things that you learn in higher education, and in a world as hostile to African Americans and black folks as 19th century America. You're not necessarily going to find someone who's willing to spell that kind of stuff out for you unless you sound good, sound competent, and this is where all this kind of stuff kind of links together. And lastly, it all basically comes down to humanity. People see those that are more poor, lower class, more ignorant than themselves as being less human. It's why the stimulus bill that passed today was $250 billion for everybody in America, but 1/8 of $1 trillion was, $250 billion was for your normal folks, and then $1.75 trillion was for the rich and the famous and big business. Because they don't deem those that they see as lesser, those with less fancy jobs, less education, as being their equals or worthy of that investment. And for black Americans, this is a huge deal. This is why Frederick Douglass is so important. He gets in and schmoozes with upper crust northern society, and by being well educated, well spoken, charismatic, smart, funny, compelling, almost single handedly moves the dial on art black people inferior to white people. And it's much harder again to discount someone who's well educated and well spoken in that manner. If a racist hick is trying to argue that a black man is inferior to him and sounds like a complete tool, and the black man is well educated and smart, and again, we're not relying on common humanity here. As we probably have figured out by now in this class, there's not a lot of love for one's fellow man in 19th century United States. But it is a much harder case to make that the person that's obviously smarter, better educated, and better spoken than you is inferior to you in a public setting. It's an important skill set for abolition and gaining abolitionist support and momentum. In the North, only about a third of blacks are free, or excuse me, free blacks are educated. In the South, it's only 4%. So while a third of blacks is not good, less than 1/20th of blacks is way worse. New Orleans actually sees a education rate closer to that of the North of about a third, but the rest of Louisiana is still only at 4%. And the reason why is, as we've touched on a couple of times, the city of New Orleans is weird. The city of New Orleans, to go on a little bit of a tangent, I find to be fascinating in this time period because it kind of shows off the fact that the idea of race and racism is a complete fabrication, a complete social construct. There's no biology or truth to it at all, because the reason why New Orleans, the largest city in the South, not including Baltimore, and fifth largest in the United States, has a significant portion of its white aristocracy that is mixed race, the famous Creole elite. They're all educated. They're mostly upper middle class to rich, unless they've fallen upon hard times. And they are treated with the finest educations, the most luxury, the most wealth, and they see themselves as superior to the point where they basically suffer a drain of black population in the city. They sell a giant chunk, dropping from 66% black to only 40% black in the space of about a decade, by selling all of their domestic and skilled servants off to work to death in the cotton fields and the swamps of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, seeing themselves as greater than, superior to their fellow African Americans, black Americans, based on this lie that because they have white parents, that makes them better. Or excuse me, a white parent, that makes them better. And it's incredibly disgusting. But it just goes to kind of show you the importance of those connections, of that education, and of public perception. These Creoles would be seen as interracial trash in Georgia or the Carolinas, and would probably be at risk of either being barred from moving in, or being enslaved as escaped slaves, for the reward of the slave catchers post 1850. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and their connections brings us to the next topic: institutions, societies, and the importance of groups. Part of why education is important and jobs are important, and the battle for jobs in the North and in the West is huge, is because it gets you in the club. George Carlin very famously said, "It's a big club, and you're not in it." The Democrats are in it, the Republicans are in it. It's kind of true. Even in the 19th century, unions are a thing. Unions have an important job in theory in America. They're supposed to guarantee the wealth of the workers, make sure they're not taken advantage of by their bosses, establish a certain baseline of living conditions and working hours. And it is a battle that is eventually won by black workers in the 1840s into the 1850s, so that they get to be a part of these unions. Because one of the things that unions also do is act as gatekeepers. They keep people who aren't part of the union from being able to work those jobs, and those jobs tend to be some of the higher paying and better set up jobs with better working conditions. These unions also wield a great deal of political power and are involved in the political parties. These political parties control the laws. How do you stop anti-black? How do you stop black codes and anti-black laws from being passed? You have to influence politics. And how do you influence politics if you don't have the right to vote or run for office? Well, part of that is by wielding influence through the unions, through your work, through donations, and definitely not bribes. The other way is by being part of one of the millions of secret societies, like the Freemasons or Illuminati, who, rather than, as the Da Vinci Code will tell you, are attempting to take over the world, or Angels and Demons says that they've been hiding cold fusion from the world for whatever reason. No, they're mostly just there, so in an age before Netflix and television and the internet and the radio and the TV, for a bunch of rich white dudes to go out, go to brothels, cheat on their wives, smoke cigars, and drink expensive whiskey with one another while horse trading, doing room deals, and quid pro quos out of the public eye. In this case, it's a big club and you're out, and it is in fact literal. But by the 1850s, you see influential black folks begin to get into some of these societies. And ultimately it's all about networking. It's not necessarily what you know, it's who you know, who owes you favors. And are they willing to go to bat for you and vouch for you, especially if you're a black man like Frederick Douglass or Henry Garnett in the 1840s, 1850s, and you need someone to get you in the room. If you don't have access to the room, you can't change those minds. If you can't change those minds, you can't set, the desire for abolition ablaze and start making real progress in that direction. It is an enormous deal that they get access to these groups. And education, coming back around, is a huge reason why these are the individuals who are the ones that are the movers and shakers amongst the free blacks in the abolition movement. While Harriet Tubman, for example, who we'll talk about next week, does a great job of helping individual black folks get free, the most influential white abolitionist she is associated with is James Brown from the Bleeding Kansas incident. And he is Bleeding Kansas incident. John Brown. Blah. John Brown is not a politically influential individual. He is instead a man of great passion, willing to commit great violence for a good cause. And those are two entirely separate skill sets.